Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of World War II and the Pacific Theater. In this lecture, we're going to continue discussing the process of island hopping as U.S. forces gradually approached Japan itself, and finally we'll talk about the use of the atomic bomb at the end of the war. In the previous lecture, we talked about some of the engagements that began to turn the tide in the Pacific War, and most pointedly the Battle of Midway, which really turned the momentum of the war in June of 1942. I then mentioned the process that's been called by historians island hopping, and we're going to talk more about that over the next few minutes in this lecture. But one of the things that's important to note about this process, and I pointed out the American Navy, which split into two broad elements, moving across the southern Pacific and then more through the central Pacific. It's important to note that they didn't have to conquer every Japanese garrison along the way. In fact, at several points along the way, American forces, once they had conquered some of the key islands, perhaps with airstrips or fueling stations, would simply skip over islands where, in some cases, very strong Japanese forces were stationed. And they were left essentially isolated, stranded on the vine, so to speak, unable to cause any damage. And so the American Navy and their forces were able to just bypass some important Japanese outposts. Nonetheless, as I've described, the process remained very difficult, and fighting on these islands was particularly brutal. Along with the Battle of Midway, another of the key turning point conflicts in the Pacific occurred at Guadalcanal, located in the Solomon Islands, right around here. And between August 1942 and February 1943, there were a series of both naval and land battles that occurred at Guadalcanal. As mentioned, these spread out over about 8 months and really took place during the period when momentum was beginning to shift in this war in the Pacific. And so there were several different times where Japanese forces overwhelmed the island, then American forces would take it back, then there would be a naval engagement. But over the course of those 8 months, American forces were eventually able to secure Guadalcanal, this important kind of outpost in the Solomon Islands, and then continue the process of moving on ever closer to the big island of Japan itself. But Guadalcanal was an early engagement in the Pacific, occurring not long after the Battle of Midway, and further symbolized the shift in momentum. With victories at Midway and Guadalcanal and other places as well, American forces began this process of closing in on Japan. It took several years and involved some of the most vicious fighting in the war. I'm going to mention just a few of the key engagements at places like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But understand there were dozens of key battles, key islands with landing strips and fueling stations and so on, each of which involved a desperate defense by Japanese forces. And the closer the Americans got to Japan, the more intense and desperate the fighting became. The process of an ever-shrinking defensive perimeter, similar to what we discussed with Germany in Europe, as the Allies closed in on Germany, they had to defend a smaller and smaller area. The same was true of Japan. If you just look at the map and get a sense of the vast extent of Japan's reach when it was at the height of its powers in 1942, it simply was impractical and impossible to defend thousands and thousands of miles of open ocean. And so as the perimeter began to shrink, Japan was able to more and more capably focus its defensive forces, meaning that each of these encounters was more vicious and difficult than the last. One noteworthy engagement occurred at the island of Saipan, which is here in the northern Mariana Islands. And you get a sense that by this time, the American forces are getting fairly close to Japan itself. So this was an important stop along the way, not only tactically, but also we're beginning to reach closer and closer to people who would really consider themselves Japanese. The Battle of Saipan took place in June and July of 1944, so just note it's virtually simultaneous with the D-Day invasion in Europe, and involved similar kinds of operations, amphibious attacks, and a very heavy bombardment of the island before the actual attack. But American troops were surprised that once they had successfully stormed the island and won this battle, that hundreds of Japanese civilians threw themselves off the cliffs of the island onto the reefs below, along with several Japanese commanders and soldiers as well, committing suicide rather than falling victim to the American invaders. This is testament to the propaganda that Japanese leaders had successfully spread about the horrors of American rule, but also speaks to the desperation of the Japanese defense by that point. Nonetheless, we should also note that with the conquest of the Solomon Islands, the Americans were able to launch bombing attacks directly against Japan itself. And so by that point in mid-1944, the war against Japan was really escalated. In late 1944, the United States was able to achieve victory in the Philippines through intense naval engagements like the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and just further secure their movement towards a final attack against Japan itself. Another key battle took place at Iwo Jima, which brought American naval forces about halfway closer to Japan itself than the Mariana Islands. And it also featured an intense battle for Mount Suribachi, and at the end of that battle, American Marines famously raised the American flag at the top of that mountain, creating one of the most famous images of the war. But this battle also highlighted just how difficult these conquests were going to become. Iwo Jima had been thoroughly dug in by the Japanese, was filled with networks of caves and holes dug into the ground, and Japanese forces refused to surrender, making the battle for Iwo Jima incredibly intense. A final battle to note was the battle for Okinawa, a large island, and at that point now we're getting very close to Japan itself. This battle took place in April of 1945 and featured again some of the most intense Japanese defense seen up to that point. The Japanese had been deploying kamikaze pilots for several months prior to that, but they were used extensively in the battle for Okinawa. Kamikaze, of course, being suicidal pilots crashing their planes, often strapped with bombs, onto American ships. That battle also featured one of Japan's largest battleship, the Yamato, which was overcome with surprising ease and just highlighted that by this stage in the war at the end, as we're heading through 1945, battleships were far less useful than they had been previously. And that ship, one of the largest battleships in the world, actually proved to be far too slow on the seas. And it was easily attacked with submarines and light cruisers and ultimately sunk in that battle. It was a powerful symbolic gesture of the dominance by that point in the war of American forces. With the victory in Okinawa, the American forces were now just one step away from the final conquest of Japan. And so debate and discussion among American military leadership hinged on what approach should be taken. Do we need to undertake a massive land invasion of Japan that would surely be much larger than even the D-Day invasion? Or might there be other alternatives? In July 1945, Harry Truman received word from a group of scientists in Los Alamos, New Mexico, that they had successfully detonated the first atomic bomb. You see a picture of that on the lower left here. Truman wrote in his diary, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world." Indeed they had. And yet Truman knew that the bomb was his way to avoid, perhaps, a terribly costly land invasion of their determined foe. And so the debate began. Do we use the bomb? Well, clearly using the atomic bomb would certainly involve the death of many civilians, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. Its destructive power, frankly, was unknown at that point, and so any estimation of casualties was just that. On the other hand, some would argue that this was just the next logical step in a war that had grown increasingly destructive. The Americans had engaged in a systematic bombing of Japanese cities since they had taken Okinawa. One night of incendiary bombing had left 100,000 Japanese dead and had left entire cities burned to the ground. Recall that many Japanese buildings are made essentially out of paper and wood, and they burn very easily, and when an entire town goes up, it creates a great conflagration. So when you look at a picture like that on the right, it almost looks like an atomic bomb itself had been used. And so for some, the atomic bomb was just the next progression in an increasingly destructive war. Well, of course, ultimately, Truman and the Americans decided to use the bomb. In July, the Allies issued a warning to Japanese leadership: unconditional surrender or swift and utter destruction. The Japanese refused, and on August 6, 1945, the bomber plane called the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese port city of Hiroshima. The blast killed some 80,000 people within seconds, and the lingering effect killed a total of more than 150,000. Now, there are a number of elements of this we could mention, but I'll mention one because it has become a particularly famous episode in recent years, and that is related to the ship, the USS Indianapolis, that delivered the bomb to Tinian, where ultimately it would be sent on its final mission against Hiroshima. The Indianapolis, after delivering the bomb, was torpedoed and sunk, leaving the sailors adrift on the open sea. The mission was top secret, so it was about a week before anyone even knew the ship was missing and sent search teams. This led, incidentally, to one of the great monologues in movie history from the movie Jaws. And if you have seen that movie, you might remember this speech of Quint, the shark hunter. He was a sailor on board the Indianapolis, and this launched his hatred of sharks and continued warfare against sharks. This became one of the largest shark attacks in history, and hundreds of sailors perished before about 300 of them could be rescued. In the aftermath of Hiroshima, the Soviet Union, on August 8th, 2 days after Hiroshima, kept their promise and joined the war against Japan. And then, of course, the United States dropped the second bomb on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th. Nagasaki, a much more civilian center than the city of Hiroshima. And this resulted in about 140,000 deaths. So the Japanese at that point could only have envisioned atomic bombs raining down on their cities every other day. And so after the second bomb at Nagasaki, it wasn't long before the Japanese surrendered. It took a few weeks to gather up the necessary people to get signatures and so on, but by September 2nd, the Japanese surrendered, fittingly on board the battleship Missouri. The Missouri was one of the ships that had been attacked in the attack at Pearl Harbor and severely damaged. And also Missouri was the home state of the President, Harry Truman. These are a few images related to the bombing at Hiroshima. You see the explosion itself on the left-hand side, and the city in the aftermath on the lower right looks an awful lot like the scene of one of the fire bombings. The atomic bomb was a different sort of weapon, though. You see on the top right the kind of physical damage and scarring that could be done. And of course, no one really understood how long the effects of radiation damage would linger. And in fact, people were dying from this and other atomic attacks for years after the initial bombing. And here are a couple of pictures of the final surrender of the Japanese on September 2nd on board the Missouri. Unlike Victory in Europe Day, VJ Day, as it's known, September 2nd, didn't leave the kind of lingering concerns and second thoughts that we saw after Victory in Europe. The war was thoroughly over with the Japanese surrender. However, there's still much to tally and much to consider in the aftermath of the end of World War II. And it is to that subject that we will turn in our next lecture and the final lecture of this course.